don't coax me back into your arms. I've been fooled many times by your charms. I know if I kissed you, I might not resist you. I don't want to be hurt anymore. Please don't coax me back into your arms. I've been fooled many times by your charms. I know if I kissed you, I might not resist you. I don't want to be hurt anymore. I don't want to be hurt anymore.
Hello, Brobs. We're back with Donna Tartt's The Little Friend, somewhere in the midst of chapter 3. And let me see where the hell this is. Open the chat in case anyone comes in. Doubtful, except for people that say I love God. And there we go. Ida Rue poked her head through the door of Harriet's room, her arms full of fresh towels. You ain't cutting pictures from that book, are you? She said, eyeing a pair of scissors on the rug. No, ma'am, said Harriet. Faintly, through the open window, drifted the whir of chainsaws, trees toppling one by one. Expansion was all the deacons thought about at the Baptist church. New rec rooms, new parking lot, a new youth center. Soon there would not be a tree left on the block. I better not catch you doing any such. Yes, ma'am. What them scissors out for, then? Belligerently, she nodded at them. You put them up, she said, this minute. Harriet obediently went to her bureau and put the scissors in the drawer and closed it. Ida sniffed and trundled off. Harriet sat down on the foot of her bed and waited, and as soon as Ida was out of earshot, she opened the drawer and got the scissors out again. Harriet had 7 yearbooks for Alexandria Academy, starting with first grade. Pemberton had graduated 2 years before. Page by page, she turned through his senior yearbook, studying every photograph. There was Pemberton all over the place. In group pictures of the tennis and golf teams in plaid pants, slumped at a table in the study hall, in black tie, standing in front of a glittery backdrop, swagged with white bunting, along with the rest of the homecoming court. His forehead was shiny and his face glowed a fierce, happy red. He looked drunk. Diane Levitt, Lisa Levitt's big sister, had a gloved hand through his elbow, and though she was smiling, she looked a little stunned that Angie Stanhope, and not her, had just been announced homecoming queen. And then the senior portraits, tuxedos, pimples, pearls, big-jawed country girls, looking awkward in the photographer's drape. Twinkly Angie Stanhope, who'd won everything that year, who'd married right out of high school, who now looked so pasty and faded and thick about the waist when Harriet saw her in the grocery store. But there was no sign of Danny Ratliff. Had he failed, dropped out? She turned a page to baby pictures of the graduating seniors. Diane Levitt talking on a plastic telephone. Scowling Pem in a soggy diaper, swaggering about a toy pool, and with a shock found herself looking down at a photo of her dead brother. Yes, Robin, there he was, opposite, on a page to himself, frail and freckled and glad, wearing a huge straw hat that looked as if it might belong to Chester. He was laughing, not as if he was laughing at something funny, but in a sweet way, as if he loved the person who was holding the camera. "Robin, we miss you," read the caption, and underneath his graduating classmates had all signed their names. For a long time, she studied the picture. She would never know what Robin's voice had sounded like, but she had loved his face all her life and had followed its modulations tenderly throughout a fading trail of snapshots. Random moments, miracles of ordinary light. What would he have looked like grown up? There was no way of knowing. To judge from his photograph, Pemberton had been a very ugly baby, broad-shouldered and bow-legged, with no neck and no indication at all that he would grow up to be handsome. There was no Danny Ratliff in Pem's class for the previous year, though there was a Pem again as Jolly Jr., but running her finger down the alphabetized list of the class behind Pemberton's, suddenly she landed on his name, Danny Ratliff. Her eye jumped to the column opposite. Instead of a photograph, there was only a spiky cartoon of a teenager with his elbows on a table, poring over a piece of paper that said, "Exam Cheat Sheet." Below the drawing, jangly beatnik capitals read, "Too busy, photo not available." So he'd failed at least 1 year. Had he dropped out of school after the 10th grade? When she went back another year, she finally found him, a boy with thick bangs, brushed low on his forehead, covering his eyebrows, handsome, but in a threatening way, like a hoodlum pop star. He looked older than a 9th grader. His eyes were half hidden beneath the low fringe of hair, which gave him a mean, hooded look. His lips were insolently pursed, as if he was about to spit out a piece of gum or blow a raspberry. She studied the picture for a long time, then carefully she scissored it out and tucked it in her orange notebook. "Harriet, get down here," Ida's voice at the foot of the stairs. "Ma'am," called Harriet, hastening to finish. "Who been poking holes in this lunch bucket?" Healy did not call that afternoon or that night. The next morning, which was rainy, he didn't come by either. So Harriet decided to walk over to Edie's house to see if she had made breakfast. "A deacon," said Edie, trying to turn a profit from a church outing of windows and retired ladies. She was dressed handsomely in khaki shirt and dungarees, for she was to spend the day working at the Confederate cemetery with the garden club. "Well," lips pursed, mimicking Mr. Dow's voice, "but Greyhound would charge you $80. "Greyhound? Well," I said, "I find that not at all surprising. The last I heard, Greyhound was still running a money-making concern." She was looking at the newspaper over the tops of her half-moon spectacles as she said this. Her voice was queenly, withering. She had taken no notice of her granddaughter's silence, which had driven Harriet, crunching quietly at her toast, into a deeper and more determined sulk. She had felt quite hard towards Edie ever since her conversation with Ida, more so because Edie was always writing letters to congressmen and senators, getting up petitions, fighting to save this old landmark or that endangered species. Was not Ida's welfare as important as whatever Mississippi waterfowl occupied Edie's energies as profoundly? "Hello, Robs." "Sigh tricks. I eat books." "Will eat your face." "Of course, I didn't bring it up," said Edie, and sniffed an imperious sniff, as if to say, and then sniffed an imperious sniff as to say, "And he'd better be glad I didn't," as she picked up her paper and gave it a rattle. "But I never will forgive Roy Dow for the way he did Daddy on that last car he bought. Daddy got mixed up about things there at the last. He might as well have knocked Daddy on the pavement and stolen the money out of his pocket." Harriet realized that she was staying at the back door too pointedly and turned back to her breakfast, staring at the back door, that was. Let me start over there. Harriet realized that she was staring at the back door too pointedly and turned back to her breakfast. If Healy went to her house and she wasn't home, he came looking for her over here, and this was sometimes uncomfortable since Edie loved nothing better than to tease Harriet about Healy, with murmured asides about sweethearts and romance, humming infuriating little love songs under her breath. Harriet bore teasing of any sort very badly, but she could not endure being teased about boys. Edie pretended not to know this and drew back from the results of her handiwork, tears, denial, in theatrical astonishment. Methinks the lady doth protest too much, she said gaily in a merry, mocking tone that Harriet loathed, or more smugly, you must really like that little boy if it upsets you so much to talk about him. I think, said Edie, pardon, startling Harriet from these recollections, I think they ought to give them a hot lunch at school, but they ought not to give the parents a dime. She was talking about a story in the newspaper. A little earlier, she'd been talking about the Panama Canal, how crazy it was to just give the thing away. Who the hell does she think she is, Donald Trump? I guess I'll read the obituaries, she said. That's what Daddy used to say. Guess I'd better go to the obituaries first and see if anybody I know has died. She turned to the back of the paper. I wish this rain would clear up, she said, glancing out the window. Seemingly quite oblivious to Harriet, there's plenty to do inside. The potting shed needs to be cleaned, and those pots disinfected. But I guarantee you that people will wake up and take one look at this weather. As if on cue, the telephone rang. Here we go, said Edie, clapping her hands, rising from the table. The first cancellation of the morning. Harriet walked home in the drizzle with her head down, under a gigantic borrowed umbrella of Edie's witch. When she was smaller, she had used to play Mary Poppins. Water sang in the gutters, low rows of orange day lilies, beaten down by the rain, leaned towards the sidewalk at frenetic angles, as if to shout at her. She half expected Healy to run up, splashing through the puddles in his yellow slicker. She was determined to ignore him if he did, but the streamy streets were empty, no people, no cars. Since there was no one around to prevent her from playing in the rain, she hopped ostentatiously from puddle to puddle. Were she and Healy not speaking? The longest time they had ever gone without talking was in 4th grade. They had gotten into an argument at school during a winter recess in February, with sleet driving at the window panes, and all the kids agitated from being kept off the playground 3 days in a row. Oh my God. They had gotten into an argument at school during a winter recess in February with sleet driving at the window panes and all the kids agitated from being overcrowded, from being kept off the playground 3 days in a row. The classroom was overcrowded and stank of mildew and chalk dust and milk gone sour, but mainly of urine. The wall-to-wall carpet reeked of it. On damp days, the smell drove everyone wild. So the kids pinched their noses shut or pretending to gag, and even the teacher, Mrs. Miley, roamed the back part of the classroom with a can of Glade Floral Bouquet air freshener, which she sprayed in steady, relentless sweeps, even while she explained long division or gave dictation, so that a gentle deodorizing mist was perpetually settling about the heads of the children. And they went home smelling like commodes in a ladies' restroom. Mrs. Millie was not supposed to leave her class unsupervised, but she didn't enjoy the pee smell any more than the children and often plodded across the hall to gossip with the 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Rideout. She always picked a child to be in charge while she was gone, and on this occasion, she had picked Harriet. Being left in charge was no fun. While Harriet stood by the door and watched for Mrs. Miley to come back, the other kids, who had nothing to worry about except getting to their seats in time, raced around the smelly, overheated room, laughing, whining, playing tag, and throwing checkers, thumping footballs of folded new notebook paper into each other's faces. Healy and a boy named Greg DeLoach had been amusing themselves by attempting to hit Harriet in the back of the head with these thumped paper footballs as she stood watch. Both were unconcerned that she would tell. People were so afraid of Mrs. Miley that no one ever told. But Harriet was in a terrible mood because she needed to go to the bathroom and because she hated Greg DeLoach, who did things like picking his nose and eating the boogers. When Healy played with Greg, Greg's personality infected him like a disease. Together, they threw spitballs and shouted insults at Harriet and shrieked if she went anywhere near them. So when Mrs. Miley returned, Harriet told on Greg and Healy too. And for good measure, she added that Greg had called her a whore. In the past, Greg had indeed called Harriet a whore. Once, he had even called her some mysterious name that sounded like Hupper. But on this particular occasion, he hadn't called her anything worse than gross. Healy was made to memorize 50 extra vocabulary words, but Greg got the vocabulary words and 9 licks with the paddle, and one for each letter in the words damn and whore. From tough old yellow-toothed Mrs. Kennedy, who was as big as a man and did all the paddling at the elementary school. The main reason Healy was mad at Harriet for so long over this was because it took him 3 weeks to memorize the vocabulary words sufficiently to pass a written test. Harriet had reconciled herself stolidly and without much pain to life without Healy, which was life the way it always was, only lonelier. But 2 days after the test, there he was at Harriet's back door, asking her to ride bikes. Generally, after quarrels, it was Healy who struck up relations again, whether he was the one at fault or not, because he had the shorter memory and because he was the first to panic when he found himself with an hour on his hands and no one to play with. Harriet shook the umbrella, left it on the back porch, and went through the kitchen to the hall. Ida Rue stepped out of the living room and in front of her before she could go up the stairs to her room. "Listen here," she said. "You and me ain't finished with that lunch bucket. I know it was you gone and poke holes in that thing." Harriet shook her head. Though she felt compelled to stick by her previous denial, she did not have the energy for a more vigorous lie. "Reckon you want me to think somebody broke in the house and done it? It's Allison's lunchbox. You know your sister ain't poke holes in that thing," Ida called up the stairs after her. "You ain't fool me for 1 second. We're going to turn it on. We're going to bring you the power." Healy blankly sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the television with a half-eaten bowl of Giggle Pops in his lap and his Rock'em Sock'em robots. One robot unsprung, elbow dangling, shoveled to the side. Beside them, face down, lay a G.I. Joe who'd been serving as referee. The electric company was an educational program, but at least it wasn't as dumb as Mr. Rogers. He ate another listless spoonful of the Giggle Pops. They were soggy now, and the dye had turned the milk green. But the mini marshmallows were still like aquarium gravel. His mother, a few minutes before, had run downstairs and popped her head into the family room to ask if he felt like helping her make some cookies. And he was angry when he remembered how little his scornful refusal had troubled her. "Okay," she replied in all good cheer, "suit yourself." No, he could not give her the satisfaction of appearing interested. Cooking was for girls. If his mother really loved him, she would drive him to the bowling alley. He ate another spoonful of the Giggle Pops. All the sugar had soaked off them, and they didn't taste so good anymore. At Harriet's, the day dragged on. Nobody seemed to notice that Healy hadn't been around except, oddly, Harriet's mother, who could not be expected with absolute certainty to notice if a hurricane rose up and tore the roof off the house. "Where's little Price?" she called out to Harriet from the sun porch that afternoon. She called Healy Little Price because Price was his mother's maiden name. "Don't know," said Harriet curtly and went upstairs. But soon she was bored, drifting fretfully between bed and window seat, watching the rain slash against the window panes, and soon she wandered downstairs again. After loitering aimlessly for some time and being chased from the kitchen, she finally sat down in a neglected spot on the hall floor, where the boards were particularly smooth, to play a game of jacks. As she played, she counted out loud in a dull sing-song, which alternated numbingly with the thump of the ball and with Ida's monotonous song in the kitchen. "Daniel saw that stone hewn out of the mountain. Daniel saw that stone hewn out of the mountain. Daniel saw that stone hewn out of the mountain." The jack's ball was a hard miracle plastic that bounced higher than rubber. If it struck a particular raised nail head, it zinged off it at a crazy angle. And this particular raised head nail, black, slanted to one side at an angle that suggested a Chinaman's tiny sampan hat. Even this nail head was an innocent, well-meaning little object that Harriet could fasten her attention to, a welcome stiff point in the chaos of time. How many times had Harriet stepped on this raised nail head with her bare foot? It was bent over at the neck by the force of the hammer, not sharp enough to cut. Though once, when she was about 4 years old and sliding on her rear end down the hall floor, this nail had snagged and torn the seat of her underpants, blue underpants, part of a match set from the kitty corner, embroidered in pink script with the days of the week. 3, 6, 9, 1 to grow on. The nail head was steadfast. It hadn't changed since she was a baby. No, it had stayed where it was, residing quietly in its dark tidal pool behind the hall door, while the rest of the world ran haywire. Even the kitty corner, where until recently all Harriet's clothes had been bought, was now closed. Tiny, pink-powdered Mrs. Rice, a changeless fixture of Harriet's early life, with her big black eyeglasses and big gold charm bracelet, had sold it and gone into a nursing home. Harriet did not like walking past the vacant shop, though she always put her hand to her forehead and stopped to peer through the dusty plate glass window. Whenever she did, somebody had torn the curtains off their rings, and the display cases were empty. The floor was littered with sheets of newspaper and spooky little child-sized mannequins, tanned, naked, with molded page boy haircuts, stood staring this way and that in the vacant dim. Jesus was the stone hewn out of the mountain. Jesus was the stone hewn out of the mountain. Jesus was the stone hewn out of the mountain, tearing down the kingdom of this world. 4 Z's, 5 Z's. She was the Jacks champion of America. She was the Jacks champion of the world. With an enthusiasm only slightly forced, she shouted out scores, cheered for herself, rolled back on her heels in amazement at her own performance. For a while, her agitation even felt like fun. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't quite forget that nobody cared if she was having fun or not. Danny Ratliff woke from his nap with a bad start. He'd got by on very little sleep in recent weeks since his oldest brother, Farish, had set up a methamphetamine laboratory in the taxidermy shed behind their grandmother's trailer. Farish was no chemist, but the amphetamine was good enough, and the scheme itself was pure profit. Between the drugs, his disability checks, and the deer heads he stuffed for local hunters, Farish earned 5 times what he'd made in the old days, burgling houses, stealing batteries out of cars. He wouldn't go anywhere near that business now, ever since he'd gotten out of the mental hospital. Farish refused to use his considerable talents in any but an adversary capacity. Though he himself had taught his brothers everything they knew, he no longer joined them in their errands. He refused to listen to details of specific jobs, refused even to ride along in the car. Though he was vastly more gifted than his brothers in lockpicking, hot wiring, tactical reconnaissance, getaway, and nearly every aspect of the trade, this new hands-off policy was wiser for all in the end. For Farish was a master, and he was of more use at home than behind bars. The genius of the methamphetamine lab was that the taxidermy business, which Farish had run quite legitimately on and off for 20 years, gave him access to chemicals otherwise tricky to obtain. Moreover, the stink from the taxidermy operation went a long, long way towards masking the distinctive cat piss smell of the meth manufacture. The Ratliffs lived in the woods, a good distance from the road, but even so, the smell was a dead tip-off, and many a laboratory, said Farish, had been brought down by noisy neighbors or winds that blew the wrong direction, right into the window of a passing police car. The rain had stopped. The sun shone through the curtains. Danny closed his eyes against it and then rolled over with a shriek of bed springs and turned his face into his pillow. His trailer, one of 2 units behind the larger mobile home where his grandmother lived, was 50 yards from the methamphetamine lab. But between the meth and the heat and the taxidermy, the stink traveled, and Danny was sick of it nearly to vomiting. Part cat piss, part formaldehyde, part rot and death, it had penetrated nearly everything. Clothes and furniture, water and air, his grandmother's plastic cups and dishes. His brother smelled so strongly of it you could hardly stand within 6 feet of him. And once or twice Danny had been horrified to detect a whiff of it in his own sweat. He lay stiff, heart pounding. For several weeks he'd been cranked up pretty much nonstop, no sleep except a jerky catnap now and then. Blue sky, fast music on the radio, long, speedy nights that skimmed on and on towards some imaginary vanishing point while he kept his foot hard to the gas and sped right through them, one after the other, dark after light after dark again, like skimming through summer rainstorms on a long, flat stretch of highway. It wasn't about going anyplace, just about going fast. Some people, not Danny, ran so fast and far and ragged that one too many black mornings, grinding their teeth and listening to the birdies tweet before sunup and snap, bye-bye, permanently ripped, wild-eyed and flapping and twisting every which way, convinced that maggots were eating their bone marrow, that their girlfriends were cheating on them and the government was watching them through the television set, and the dogs were barking out messages in Morse code. Danny had seen one emaciated freak, Casey Rockingham, now deceased, jabbing at himself with a sewing needle until his forearms... Wait. I lost my spot. Jabbing at himself with a sewing needle until his arms looked as if they'd been plunged to the elbow in a deep fryer. Miniature hookworms were burrowing into his skin, he said. Over 2 long weeks in a state close to triumph, he sat in front of the television 24 hours a day and pried the flesh off his forearms, shouting, "Gotcha!" and "Ha!" at the imaginary vermin. Farish had come close to that shrieking frequency a time or two, one bad incident in particular, swinging a poker and screaming about John F. Kennedy, and it wasn't anywhere that Danny was ever going to be. No, he was fine, just dandy, only sweating like a tiger, too hot and a little edgy. A tick fluttered in his eyelid. Noises, even tiny ones, were starting to jerk on his nerves, but mostly he was hammered down from having the same nightmare, on and off for a week now. It seemed to hover for him, waiting for him to drop off as he lay on his bed, sliding uneasily into sleep. It pounced and grabbed him by the ankles and towed him down with sickening speed. He rolled up on his back and stared up at the swimsuit poster, taped to the ceiling. Like a nasty hangover, the vapors of the dream still pressed in on him, low and poisonous. Terrible as it was, he could never quite remember the details when he woke up. No people or situations, although there was always at least one other person, but only the astonishment of being sucked into a blind, breathless emptiness. Struggles, dark wing beats, terror. It wouldn't sound so bad to tell about, but if he'd ever had a worse dream, he couldn't remember what it was. Black flies were clustered on the half-eaten donut, his lunch that lay on the card table beside his bed. They rose in a hum when Danny stood and darted crazily for several moments before they settled on the donut again. Now that his brothers Mike and Ricky Lee were in jail for the time being, Danny had the trailer to himself, but it was old and had low ceilings, and though Danny kept it scrupulously clean, windows washed, never a dirty dish, still it was shabby and cramped. Back and forth droned the electric fan, stirring the flimsy curtains as it passed. From the breast pocket of his denim shirt, slung over a chair, he retrieved the snuff tin, which contained not snuff, but an ounce of powdered methamphetamine. He did a good-sized bump off the back of his hand. The burn felt so sweet, hitting the back of his throat just so that his eyes misted. Almost instantly, the taint lifted, colors clearer, nerves stronger, life not so bad again. Quickly, with trembling hands, he tapped himself out another bump before the jump start from the first kicked in all the way. Ah, yes, a week in the country. Rainbows and twinkles. Suddenly, he felt bright, well rested on top of the situation. Danny made his bed, tight as a drum, emptied the ashtray and washed it out in the sink, threw away the Coke can and the remnants of the donut. On the card table was a half-worked jigsaw puzzle, pallid nature scene, winter trees, and waterfall, which had been his entertainment for many a speedy night. Should he work on that for a while? Yes, the puzzle. But then his attention was arrested by the electrical cord situation. Electrical cords were tangled around the fan, climbing up the walls, running all over the room. Clock, radio, television, toaster, the whole bit. He batted the fly from around his head. Maybe he should take care of the cords, organize them a little bit. From the distant television in his grandmother's quarters An announcer's voice from World Wrestling Federation cut through the fog. Distinct. Dr. Death is flying off the handle. Get off of me, Danny found himself shouting before he was aware of doing it. He'd smacked 2 flies dead and was examining the smears across the brim of his cowboy hat. He didn't remember picking the hat up, didn't even remember it being in the room. Where did you come from? He said to it. Freaky. The flies, agitated now, were zinging all around his head, but it was that hat that concerned Danny at the moment. Why was it inside? He'd left it in the car. He was sure of it. He tossed it on the bed. Suddenly, he didn't want the thing touching him. And there was something about its jaunty angle, lying there on the neatly turned covers all by itself, that gave him the willies. Fuck it, thought Danny. He popped his neck, tugged on his jeans, and stepped outside. He found his brother, Farish, reclining in an aluminum lounge chair in front of their grandmother's mobile home, scraping the dirt from beneath his fingernails with a pocket knife. About him were strewn various cast-off distractions, a whetstone, a screwdriver, and a partially disassembled transistor radio, a paper book with a swastika on the cover. In the dirt amongst all this sat their youngest brother, Curtis, with his stumpy legs splayed out in a V in front of him, cuddling a dirty, wet kitten to his cheek and humming. Danny's mother had Curtis when she was 46 years old and a bad drunk. But though their father, a drunk himself, also deceased, loudly bemoaned the birth, Curtis was a sweet creature who loved cake, harmonica music, and Christmas, and apart from being clumsy and slow, had no fault in the world other than he was slightly deaf and liked to listen to the television turned up a little too loud. Farish, jaw clenched, nodded at Danny and did not look up. He was good and wired himself, his brown jumpsuit, a United Parcel uniform, with a hole in the chest where the label was cut off, was unzipped nearly to the waist, exposing a thatch of black chest hair. Winter or summer, Farish wore no clothing but these brown uniform jumpsuits, except if he had to go to court or to a funeral. He bought them secondhand by the dozen from the parcel service. Years before, Farish had actually been employed by the post office, though not in a parcel truck, but as a mail carrier. According to him, there existed no smoother racket for casing affluent neighborhoods, knowing who was out of town, who left their windows unlocked, and who left the papers to pile up every weekend, and who had a dog who was likely to complicate things. It was this angle which cost Farish his job as a carrier and might have sent him to Leavenworth had the district attorney been able to prove that Farish had committed any of the burglaries while on duty. Whenever anybody at the Black Door Tavern teased Farish about the UPS attire or inquired why he wore it, Farish always replied tersely that he used to be with the post office, but this was no reason. Farish was eaten up with hatred for the federal government and for the post office most of all. Danny suspected that the real reason Farish liked the jumpsuits was that he had got used to wearing a similar garment while in the mental hospital. Another story, but this wasn't the sort of thing about which Danny or anyone else felt comfortable speaking to Farish. He was about to head over to the big trailer when Farish pulled the back of his lawn chair into an upright position and snapped the pocket knife shut. His knee was jiggling to beat the band. Farish had a bad eye, white and milked over, and even after all these years, it still made Danny uneasy when Farish turned it on him suddenly, as he now did. Gum and Eugene just had a little set to in there over the television, he said. Gum was their grandmother, their father's mother. Eugene don't think Gum or to watch her people. As he spoke, the two brothers stared off across the clearing and into the dense, silent woods without looking at each other. Farish slouched massively in his chair, Danny standing beside him like passengers on a crowded train. My people was what their grandmother called her soap opera. Tall grass grew around a dead car in the high weeds. A broken wheelbarrow wallowed, belly up. Eugene says it ain't Christian. Ha, Farish said, and he slapped his knee with a whack that made Danny jump. Wrestling, he don't think it's anything wrong with, or football. What's so Christian about wrestling? Except for Curtis, who loved everything in the world, even bees and wasps and the leaves that fell from the trees. All the Ratliffs had an uneasy relationship with Eugene. He was the second brother. He'd been Farish's field marshal in the family business, which was larceny after their father died. In this, he was dutiful, if not particularly energetic or inspired. But then, while in Parchment Penitentiary for grand theft auto in the late 1960s, he had received a vision instructing him to go forth and exalt Jesus. Relations between Eugene and the rest of the family had been somewhat strained ever since. He refused to dirty his hands any longer with what he called the devil's work, though, as Gum often pointed out shrilly enough, he was happy enough to eat the food and live under the roof which the devil and his works provided. Eugene didn't care. He quoted scripture at them, bickered ceaselessly with his grandmother, and generally got on everybody's nerves. He had inherited their father's humorlessness, though not, thankfully, his violent temper, even in the old days, back when Eugene had been stealing cars and staying out drunk all night. He'd never been much fun to be around, and though he didn't hold a grudge or nurse an insult, and was fundamentally a decent guy, his proselytizing bored them all to death. "What's Eugene doing here anyway?" said Danny. "I thought he'd be down at the mission with Snake Boy." Ferris laughed, a startling high-pitched giggle. "I expect Eugene's going to leave it to Loyal while them snakes are in there." Eugene was correct in suspecting motives other than revival and Christian fellowship in the visit of Loyal Reese, for the visit had been engineered by Loyal's brother, Dolphus, from his prison cell. No shipment of amphetamine had gone out from Farish's lab since Dolphus's old courier got picked up on an outstanding warrant back in February. Danny had offered to drive the drugs up to Kentucky himself, but Dolphus didn't want anybody moving in on his distribution territory. A genuine worry for a man behind bars, and besides, why hire a courier when he had a kid brother named Loyal, who would drive it up for free? Loyal, of course, was in the dark here, because Loyal was devout and would not cooperate knowingly with any such plans as Dolphus had hatched in prison. He had a church homecoming to attend in East Tennessee. He was driving down to Alexandria as a favor to Dolphus, whose old friend Farish had a brother, Eugene, who needed help getting started in the revival business. That was all Loyal knew, but when, in all innocence, Loyal drove back home to Kentucky, he would be carrying, unawares, along with his reptiles, a number of securely wrapped bundles which Farish had concealed in the engine of his truck. "What I don't understand," said Danny, gazing off into the pine woods that pressed dark around their dusty little clearing, "is why do they handle the things in the first place? Don't they get bit?" "All the damn time," Ferris jerked his head belligerently. "Go on in and ask Eugene. He'll sure tell you more than you wanted to know about it." His motorcycle boot was jittering away. "If you mess with the snake and it don't bite you, that's a miracle. If you mess with it and it does bite you, that's a miracle too. Getting bit by a snake is no miracle. It is if you don't go to the doctor, just roll around the floor calling out to Jesus, and you live. Well, what if you die? Another miracle, lifted up to heaven through getting took in the signs." Danny snorted. "Well, hell," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "If it's miracles everywhere, what's the point?" The sky was bright blue above the pine trees, reflecting blue in the puddles on the ground, and he felt high, fine and 21. Maybe he would hop in his car and drive over to the Black Door, maybe take a spin to the reservoir. They'll find themselves a big old nest of miracles if they walk out in that brush and turn over a rock or two, said Farish sourly. Danny laughed and said, "Tell you what'll be the miracle, as if Eugene handles the snake." There wasn't much to Eugene's preaching, which, for all Eugene's religious fervor, was strangely flat and wooden, apart from Curtis, who glumped up front to get saved every time he went. He hadn't converted a soul as far as Danny knew. "You ain't never going to see Eugene handle a snake if you asked me. Eugene won't put a worm on a fishhook, say, brother." Farish, his gaze fixed upon the scrub pines across the clearing, nodded briskly, as if to switch the subject. "What you think of that big white rattlesnake done crawled up here yesterday?" He meant the meth, the batch he'd just finished, or at least Danny thought that's what he meant. Often it was hard to figure out what Farish was talking about, especially when he was wired or drunk. Say what? Farish glanced up at Danny rather jerkily and winked, a twitch of the eyelid, nearly imperceptible. Not bad, Danny said wearily, lifting his head in a way that felt easy and turning to look in the opposite direction, really smooth. Farish was apt to explode if anyone dared misunderstand him, even though most people had no idea what he was talking about half the time. Not bad. Ferris's look could go either way, but then he shook his head. Pure powder. It'll throw you through the damn window. I like to lost my mind doctoring on that iodine-smelling product last week. Ran it through mineral spirits, ringworm medicine, what have you. Stuff still so sticky I can hardly pound it up my damn nose. Tell you one thing, that's for damn sure, he chortled, falling back into his chair, clutching the arms as if readying for takeoff. A batch like this don't matter how you cut it. Suddenly he bolted upright and shouted, I said, get that thing off me. A slap, a strangled cry. Danny jumped, and from the corner of his eye saw the kitten go flying. Curtis, his lumpy features scrunched together in a rictus of grief and fear, ground a fist into his eye and stumbled after it. It was the last of the litter. Farish's German shepherds had taken care of the rest. I told him, said Farish, rising dangerously to his feet. I told him and told him never to let that cat near me. Right, said Danny, looking away.